Right. Hello, everyone. Is this on? Is this on? 1 2 1 2. So it's the roadie alphabet they call it, don't they? 1 2 1 2. It's the last keynote of the evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce Tanya Barron, who is the current chief executive of Plan UK, and she'll be talking about probably one of the most important and difficult topics in development, about working with adolescent girls. So Tanya, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, it's lovely to be here, but I'm feeling terribly guilty about keeping young people away from their Saturday nights. This seems extraordinary, and thank you for staying. I'm really excited about this opportunity, and I think it's a wonderful event, and thank you to Ravi for organising everything, I know, and Lawrence and everybody else. Okay, the reason I wanted to come here, and I guess the reason you all wanted to come here today, is because we all feel the same way, that we all feel that poverty is all of our responsibility. It doesn't matter what stage we're at of our careers, or whether we're particularly interested in economics of development or other areas. Poverty is obviously of crucial importance to all of us, and it doesn't respect boundaries or borders. I hope you'll excuse me if I'm going to start with a little quote from a very old futurist economist, Alvin Toffler. And he says this is why we should be talking to young people and to students, because he says, the secret message communicated to most young people today by the society around them is that they are not needed, that the society will run itself quite nicely until they, at some very distant point in the future, will take over the reins. Yet the fact is, the society is not running itself nicely. And we need the energy, brains, imagination and talent of young people that young people can bring to bear down on our difficulties. For society to attempt to solve its desperate problems without the full participation of young people is imbecile. So that quote from Toffler is another reason why I got on the train to talk to you today. I'm going to skip a load of things that I was going to talk about, but I will start with saying that I've been working in development for 25 years, and one of the things that I have learned every year and relearned every year is that really one of the biggest issues we face, economically and otherwise, is gender inequality. And we've heard some wonderful things from some of the speakers earlier today about why that's so important. And the realization certainly has come to me and many colleagues that it's very important to understand that tackling gender inequality is actually the right thing to do, as well as the smart thing to do. And the reason why I came up with this title of Smart Development, it was really partly spurred on because of a lot of publicity that is around at the moment from the Secretary of State, Justine Greening, talking about smart aid. And one of the worries that I have is that smart aid is very attractive, or smart development, or smart economics. It's all very attractive, and it's got a lot of mileage, and a lot of people are very excited about it, but there is a problem within it. So, one of the things, to go back one cycle, that Plan does, Plan's been around for about 77 years. It's a big global children's development and child rights organisation. And one of the things we do is we really focus our work through a lens of adolescent girls. And the reason we do that is because we know that adolescent girls have a very critical position to play as they transition from childhood to adulthood. All the discrimination and the inequalities kind of crystallize at adolescence. It isn't that small girls and girl children are, enjoy great equality. It is just that actually at adolescence, many of the factors of girls' and women's inequality crystallize. They crystallize because of it's a point where girls drop out of school. It's a point where girls get pregnant, get forced into early marriage. And so all of those disadvantages that they've all been exploited by over their years really comes into a sort of very critical phase. So that's why we concentrate on girls. The disadvantages they face start really early on with female feticide, infanticide, girls getting less food than their male siblings, low levels of healthcare, low levels of education, and numerous sorts of violence against girls, such as female genital mutilation, domestic violence, and early forced marriage. So clearly we all recognise that that's unjust. It doesn't take a stretch of the imagination to understand that that is surely not right. You'll also realise, as budding economists, that it's a huge waste of human potential and human resource. Millions of girls, and people argue about the figure, about 65 million globally are out of school, denied an education. And that is at a time when education has the power to transform not only their lives, but the communities and societies around them. So, smart economics. There's currently great emphasis and consensus in development discourses on the importance of empowering adolescent girls with education as a prerequisite to achieving development and economic growth. It will provide healthier families, lower infant mortality, greater labour force earnings. Some would argue that at a macroeconomic level, that the effectiveness and output of tomorrow's labour force will be shaped by the investment that we make today in adolescent girls. There's some evidence of smart economics, which, just to really shorthand it, is really the notion that we don't need to worry too much about rights. Actually, what we should be doing is talking in a much more economics language. And the World Bank really came up with this, goodness me, about, I suppose, over a decade ago now. And people got very excited to say, look, the reason you educate girls is because it will have an impact on GDP. And people started to quantify and monetarize all the reasons and all the benefits that a society would get from getting girls to school. So there's many pieces of research. One is the Girl Effect dividend. That's a World Bank report. And it says, recent work has begun to quantify the potential that human development investments in girls have on GDP. Reports showing that increasing secondary education for girls by 1% results in annual income increases of 0.3% per capita. And that can mean, for example, some phenomenal results equating to 30% of annual GDP rise in Uganda. Malawi and Nigeria could make as much as 27% and 26% of GDP difference. So these are very attractive arguments. The last one I'll give you is in Kenya. If you imagine that all 1.6 million adolescent girls in Kenya who currently drop out or aren't in school did complete secondary, and that the 220,000 adolescent mothers were employed instead of falling pregnant as children, the cumulative effect could be to add $3.4 billion to Kenya's gross income every year, which is actually the equivalent of the whole of the Kenyan construction sector. There are problems with those sorts of guesstimates and some of that smart economics. And I think, as Naila Kabir said earlier, we've been rather relaxed about creating all sorts of assumptions about the gains on some of things, girls' education. But nevertheless, they have been very compelling. And in some regard, this isn't too contentious, I think in some regard it was easier for certain sorts of politics and ideologies to move away from a rights-based approach to development into this smart aid. And in a way, that's partly why the Secretary of State, I think, is excited about smart aid. All the arguments that are being put forward at the moment are not to do with the rights of girls to have an education or the rights of women to a fair share of the labour market. They are all couched in these much more economic arguments to do with the value that this sort of aid will bring to a country's economy. So whilst the economic argument for investing in girls, and that's the language it's usually couched in, are compelling, there's a huge problem with it. For a start, it's a very narrow articulation of empowerment, and it completely fails to recognise the wider concerns about transforming unequal power relations between men and women. And although, in a sense, yes, by all means, look at gender inequality through the prism of economics, but we shouldn't forget that first and foremost, it's very important that we recognise that this is a matter of rights. And when you think of young women like Malala, I'm sure many of you will know who I mean, the young woman who was shot on her way to school. Surely no one would dare to imply that Malala's education is simply a channel to Pakistan's economic betterment. Educating the 33 million illiterate women in Pakistan would no doubt pay dividends for that country's economy in years to come. But that, in and of itself, is not the only reason why we should do it. Our rights are inalienable, universal and permanent. Economic models and economies in general, as we have seen, my goodness, in Europe, are shifting, nuanced, and subject to interpretation. So, to my mind, basing our explanation or our justification for educating girls, getting women into the labour market, purely on the rationale of smart economics, smart development, is incredibly dangerous. It suggests that you only would stop violence against women to enable that woman to go to work. That can't be right. It can't be right that women and girls are seen and their rights and needs and lives expressed purely in terms of their value in the labour market. And I think we've been rather casual in the way that we've accepted smart development, smart economics, and sort of lapped it up because it is compelling and it seems to provide some great answers. But I think it's been a very unhelpful way of turning our back on the importance of human rights. And the fact that gender roles and power relations systematically disadvantage girls throughout their lives, placing a lower value on them than boys, it shows that without tackling gender inequality, we will never really realise girls' and women's rights. And I think it was mentioned earlier today, we now know that reducing gender inequality, I beg your pardon, is good for the economy, even if it's not the only thing. But we also know that improving the economy does not necessarily reduce gender inequalities. So they're not, it's not a two-way street in that sense. We can't assume that there'll be a sort of trickle down of equality, equity and rights. It doesn't work like that. So I wouldn't seek to understate the importance of economic factors in female empowerment. A young woman's ability to earn independently is an indisputable route to her better health, her better enjoyment of her own life, and a more fulfilling existence. But dismantling economic inequality is inextricably linked to dismantling political and social inequality too. As well as supporting girls and women into employment, we should support women and girls to participate in politics, to undertake collective action, to access leadership opportunities, and enjoy the freedom to challenge and change social norms. So yes, let's fight for girls' education, for better access to sexual health services, and for lives lived without fear of violence. But let's do it not just because it's the smart thing to do, but let's do it because it's the right thing to do. And so where do we go from here? We've already had some interesting comments about the post-2015 development framework that will replace the Millennium Development Goals. Clearly, one of the demands that we are making, and in discussions with government, are that there's a standalone goal on gender. And the reason we're doing it, and I'll finish on this point really, is that we've already had evidence in Europe, perhaps it would have been a surprise to us 10 years ago to find that our lessons of the lack of stability, the dangers to what we thought were one rights and goals actually happened in Europe. So the economic crisis in Europe, and Greece was mentioned just now, has shown, and we've just published research with ODI, showing that in this recent economic downturn, women and girls have been very disproportionately affected. Closures of services, austerity budgets, there's been a very disproportionate impact on particularly on young girls. So we know that we can't rely on the smart development rationale to protect the rights of girls and women to flourish, to have an education, and to participate in the economy. I'm going to finish there, or no one will ever get any supper tonight. I'd like very much again to thank the Marshall Society and everybody here for creating such an interesting opportunity for all of us to come and bring ideas about development, worries, concerns, positive ideas for the future to you. And I hope that in weeks, months, years ahead, some of you may get in touch. Some of you may want to decide that development is your thing. And it would be very exciting to see where we go from here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for a fitting closing speech to our conference. Plan's work certainly embodies everything we wanted to achieve today. This now brings the conference to a close. I'd like you all to join me and thank all of our speakers one more time. Without them, the stimulating discussion we've had wouldn't be possible. So we thank you all for attending the conference and sticking around for the whole day. And we hope to see you at future Marshall Society events and conferences. So we wish you a pleasant journey back home, and thank you once again.